In the late summer of 1888, General Henri Alexis Brialmont stood on a hillside overlooking the Belgian city of Liège and envisioned a ring of steel and concrete that would make the city impregnable. The greatest military engineer in Europe, Brialmont had earned the nickname the Belgian Vauban after France's legendary fortress architect. His task was monumental: create a defensive barrier that could withstand any army attempting to cross Belgium's strategic position between Germany and France. Over the next 3 years, 12 massive fortresses rose from the earth in a perfect circle around Liège. 6 large triangular forts and 6 smaller installations formed an iron ring 7 to 9 kilometers from the city center, each positioned 3 to 5 kilometers apart to create interlocking fields of fire. No enemy could approach Liège without coming under devastating crossfire from multiple positions simultaneously. Fort de Pontis dominated the northern approaches. Fort de Barchan guarded the northeast. Fort de Fleron watched the eastern roads. Fort de Boncelles anchored the southern defenses. Fort de Fleymas protected the southwest. And Fort de Lonsen, the mightiest of them all, commanded the northwest approaches with twin 210mm howitzer turrets capable of hurling shells 10 kilometers in any direction. The construction consumed staggering resources. Fort de Pontis alone required 100,000 cubic meters of concrete. Each large fort featured 4 meters of unreinforced concrete atop its central massif, designed to deflect any shell then known to military science. Retractable armored gun cupolas manufactured by the German Krupp Works and French Creusot armories could rise to fire, then descend behind protective steel domes weighing dozens of tons. The forts sat low to the ground, semi-submerged profiles presenting minimal targets to enemy artillery. Inside these concrete mountains, garrisons of 350 to 500 men lived in underground chambers stocked with ammunition, food, and water sufficient for month-long sieges. Magazines held hundreds of tons of gunpowder. Ventilation systems, though primitive by later standards, promised breathable air even under bombardment. Electric lights powered by internal generators illuminated the corridors. The forts represented the cutting edge of 1880s military technology. Belgian military planners examined the specifications with satisfaction. The forts were engineered to resist 210mm artillery, the largest mobile guns existing anywhere in the world in 1890. Shells of that caliber weighed approximately 90 to 100 kilograms. Test firings demonstrated that 4 meters of concrete could absorb direct hits without catastrophic damage. The turret mechanisms, protected by steel armor plating, would remain operational even under sustained bombardment. By 1891, when the last fort received its garrison, Belgium possessed what military journals across Europe described as one of the strongest fortress complexes on the continent. Visitors marveled at the engineering. Military attachés from foreign armies studied the designs. General Brialmont himself lectured at military academies about the principles of modern fortification. Yet, Brialmont harbored concerns his superiors dismissed. He warned that fortifications required continuous modernization. Artillery technology advanced rapidly. What resisted shells in 1890 might prove vulnerable to weapons developed in 1900 or 1910. The Belgian government, confident in their fortress ring and unwilling to allocate additional funds, took no action on his recommendations. Hidden flaws compromised the seemingly impregnable defenses. The concrete lacked steel reinforcement, a technique not yet standard in the 1880s. Worse, a critical construction error created dangerous weaknesses. Concrete could not be poured at night due to inadequate illumination, meaning each day's pour partially dried before the next day's work began. This created weak bonding layers between sections that would separate catastrophically under stress. In October 1912, Belgian military observers attended Russian artillery tests that demonstrated 150mm shells could jam turret mechanisms while 280mm shells could dislodge entire cupolas. The Belgian government filed the reports and did nothing. Ammunition magazines remained positioned dangerously close to the surface rather than being moved deeper underground. Only Fort Lawson possessed mechanical ventilation. The other forts relied on passive air circulation through shafts that could be blocked by bombardment. The Belgian population, unaware of these technical concerns, viewed the fortress ring with pride and confidence. Newspaper articles proclaimed Liège's defenses invincible. Military parades featured artillery crews from the forts demonstrating their equipment. School children learned that Belgium's neutrality was guaranteed by treaty, but if violation came, the fortresses would hold until French and British allies arrived. By August 1914, the fortress ring had stood for 23 years without firing a shot in anger. The garrisons performed routine maintenance, conducted training exercises, and rotated through comfortable peacetime schedules. Artillery crews practiced loading drills on their massive guns. Infantry detachments patrolled the intervals between forts. Officers hosted visiting dignitaries and explained the defensive systems with professional pride. Lieutenant General Gerard Liman commanded the Liège garrison and the Belgian 3rd Division, approximately 32,000 troops supported by 280 guns. A career soldier of rigid discipline and unshakable determination, Liman had studied the fortress ring extensively and believed it could withstand any assault. He understood the strategic calculation. Liège controlled the bridges over the Meuse River and the critical railway lines connecting Germany to France. Any German invasion through Belgium would require capturing Liège. On August 2, 1914, Germany delivered an ultimatum demanding free passage for its armies through Belgian territory. King Albert I rejected the demand immediately. War was coming, and everyone knew it. The fortress garrisons went to full alert. Ammunition was distributed, turrets were tested, observation posts scanned the horizons for approaching columns. Liman issued orders to his commanders with absolute confidence. The forts would hold. The intervals would be defended by field troops. The Germans would break themselves against concrete and steel. Belgium's honor and neutrality would be preserved by courage and engineering. The fortress ring that would never fall awaited its first test. August 4, 1914, dawned clear and hot across eastern Belgium. German columns crossed the border in the early morning darkness, advancing along multiple roads toward Liège. The Army of the Meuse, commanded by General Otto von Immich, comprised approximately 59,800 troops organized into 6 reinforced brigades supported by 100 artillery pieces. Their orders were explicit: capture Liège within 48 hours and secure the railway bridges for the massive armies following behind. The Schlieffen Plan, Germany's master strategy for fighting a two-front war against France and Russia, depended on rapid movement through Belgium. Every day of delay allowed French armies to deploy along the border and Russian forces to mobilize in the east. The German General Staff had allocated just 2 days to smash through Belgium's premier fortress complex. Confidence ran high in the German ranks. Modern infantry tactics, superior artillery, and overwhelming numbers would crush outdated static defenses. At dawn on August 5, Captain Brinkmann, the German military attaché stationed in Brussels, arrived at Liège under a white flag of truce. He carried a formal demand for surrender: open the city and the fortress ring to German passage or face destruction. General Lemmon received him with cold courtesy in the city's administrative buildings. Brinkmann delivered his ultimatum with diplomatic formality, expressing regret at the necessity but emphasizing the futility of resistance. Lemmon's response entered Belgian legend: "Frayez-vous le passage," fight your way through." The interview ended. Brinkmann departed. Within hours, German artillery opened fire, and infantry columns advanced toward the fortress ring from multiple directions simultaneously. The initial attacks targeted 5 forts: Chaudfontaine to the southeast, Fléron to the east, Evigné to the east, Barkhon to the northeast, and Pontis to the north. German infantry advanced in dense columns along roads and through fields toward positions they expected to overwhelm through sheer numbers and aggressive assault. Belgian forward observation posts spotted the approaching formations and telephoned warnings to the forts. Fort de Barkhon's garrison watched through periscopes as German infantry emerged from tree lines approximately 3 kilometers distant. The Belgian artillery commander waited until the columns closed to 2,000 meters, then gave the order. The 210mm howitzers roared, hurling massive shells into the packed German formations. Explosions tore through the ranks. Soldiers scattered for cover. The attack stalled as casualties mounted. At Fort de Fléron, German infantry attempting to rush the approaches met concentrated fire from rapid-firing 57mm guns positioned in armored casemates. These quick-firing weapons could discharge 15 rounds per minute, creating a wall of steel that shredded attacking formations. German soldiers dove into ditches and shell craters, pinned down and unable to advance. Officers urged their men forward. Machine gun crews set up positions to suppress Belgian firing slits, but the concrete fortifications absorbed the small arms fire without effect. Fort de Pontis, dominating the northern approaches, engaged German artillery batteries attempting to establish firing positions. The Belgian 150mm turret guns possessed greater range and accuracy than the German field artillery. Counter-battery fire destroyed several German gun positions and forced others to withdraw beyond effective range. The Belgian crews worked with professional efficiency, loading and firing in practiced rhythms, while shells from German guns burst against the fortress exterior without penetrating. By late afternoon on August 5, every German assault had been bloodily repulsed. Casualties mounted into the hundreds, then thousands, as infantry attacks broke against concrete and steel. German commanders pulled back to reassess. The confident expectation of rapid victory evaporated in the reality of modern fortification warfare. These were not the stone walls of previous centuries that infantry could storm with courage and bayonets. These were killing machines designed to dominate vast areas with interlocking fire. As dusk fell on August 5, a new sound reached Liège, the drone of an aircraft engine. A German Zeppelin airship, Z-6, operating from its base near Cologne, appeared over the city in history's first aerial bombing raid on a European city. The airship dropped bombs on civilian areas, killing 9 residents and wounding others. The attack achieved no military purpose, but demonstrated Germany's willingness to employ all available weapons regardless of civilian cost. The German High Command, receiving reports of the day's failures, ordered a major night assault. 6 brigades would attack in 5 columns during darkness, attempting to exploit gaps between the forts where Belgian field troops held the intervals. The operation would begin at 2:30 in the morning of August 6th. Thunderstorms rolled across the region that night, adding confusion to an already complex operation. German infantry advanced through darkness and rain, attempting to maintain formation while navigating unfamiliar terrain. Belgian field troops dug into defensive positions between the forts, opened fire as German columns approached. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness. Artillery shells burst with orange flame. The entire perimeter erupted in violence. The 34th German Brigade, attacking the northern sector between Forts Liers and Pontis, walked into a killing ground. Belgian infantry and machine guns fired into the advancing formations at point-blank range. Artillery from both flanking forts bracketed the German positions with devastating accuracy. Bodies piled in heaps, wounded men crawled through mud seeking cover. By dawn, the 34th Brigade had suffered 1,180 casualties, nearly a quarter of its strength, and achieved nothing. Other German columns fared little better. The 27th Brigade, attacking toward Fort Boncelles, lost its way in the darkness and rain, stumbling into swampland where men sank to their knees in mud. Belgian defenders engaged them at close range. The attack dissolved into chaos. The 11th Brigade, assaulting between Forts Evnier and Fléron, met concentrated defensive fire and recoiled with heavy losses. But one German column found success. The 14th Brigade, commanded by Major General Friedrich von Wussow, discovered a gap between Forts Evnier and Fléron where Belgian field troops had spread thin. Von Wussow personally led his troops through the breach, advancing toward the city despite heavy resistance from Belgian rearguards. At Réthène, a village inside the fortress ring, Belgian infantry made a desperate stand. Street fighting raged through the darkness and into August 6th. Von Wussow pushed forward personally to direct his men. A Belgian bullet struck him down, killing him instantly. Command fell to Quartermaster General Erich Ludendorff, theoretically present only as an observer, but now thrust into direct leadership of an advancing brigade deep inside enemy defenses. Ludendorff seized the moment with brilliant audacity. He pushed the 14th Brigade through Réthène and into the outskirts of Liège itself. Fighting raged house to house through Queue de Bois and other suburbs. Belgian troops contested every street. German casualties mounted steadily, but Ludendorff drove his men forward relentlessly, reaching the city center by August 7th. That morning, in an act of extraordinary boldness, Ludendorff approached the citadel of Liège, an old fortress in the city center, and personally knocked on the gate. The Belgian garrison, isolated from communication with other units and believing themselves surrounded by overwhelming forces, surrendered. Ludendorff's gamble succeeded brilliantly. The audacious feat would propel him to supreme command later in the war. General Lehmann, receiving reports of German forces in the city center and believing he faced overwhelming numbers, made a critical decision. Evacuate the 3rd Division field troops westward to join the main Belgian army near Brussels while the fortress garrisons continued fighting. He relocated his own headquarters to Fort de Lonson, the strongest position in the ring. The Germans now held Liège's city center, but all 12 forts remained in Belgian hands, their guns still dominating the approaches and railway lines. The bridges over the Meuse stood intact but unusable under Belgian artillery fire. The 2-day timeline had expired. The massive German armies scheduled to advance through Belgium remained bottlenecked at the frontier. The fortress ring, though penetrated, had not fallen. Both Emich and Ludendorff received Germany's highest military honor, the Pour le Mérite, for their achievements. But the strategic reality remained unchanged. Until the forts fell, the Schlieffen Plan could not proceed. With Liège's city center secured but the fortress ring intact, German commanders faced a sobering reality. Infantry assaults against modern fortifications were suicide, and field artillery lacked the power to reduce concrete emplacements 4 meters thick. The situation demanded heavy siege artillery, weapons specifically designed to crack open permanent fortifications. The German army brought forward its 210mm Škoda mortars, massive siege guns manufactured in Austria-Hungary specifically for fortress warfare. These weapons fired shells weighing approximately 130 kilograms, using high-angle trajectories that allowed them to strike horizontal surfaces like fort roofs rather than the thicker vertical walls. Crews of dozens of men maneuvered the multi-ton weapons into prepared positions, dug protective earthworks, and began systematic bombardment. Fort de Barchon, commanding the northeastern approaches, became the first priority target. On August 8th, German artillery observers established forward positions with clear views of the fort and began directing fire. The 210mm mortars opened up, hurling shells in high arcs that descended almost vertically onto the fort's concrete roof. Inside Fort de Barchon, the garrison experienced the beginning of a nightmare that would soon engulf all the fortresses. Each impact transmitted shockwaves through the concrete structure, shaking the entire installation. Dust filled the corridors. Light fixtures swung wildly on their mountings. The ventilation shafts, designed to bring fresh air into the underground chambers, began emitting something far more deadly: toxic gases from the high explosive shells. The 210mm shells contained powerful bursting charges that detonated with tremendous force, throwing up clouds of smoke and chemical residue. With the ventilation system drawing this poisonous mixture into the fort's interior spaces, the garrison faced a choice between suffocation and surrender. By 5 p.m. on August 8th, after enduring bombardment for hours, Fort de Barchon's commander ordered the white flag raised. The garrison emerged coughing and gasping, their faces blackened by smoke and dust. Fort de Barchon became the first fortress in the ring to fall. The German artillery shifted fire to other targets. Fort de Vegne, the small eastern fort that had repulsed infantry attacks on August 5, now came under sustained bombardment. The 210mm shells hammered the concrete roof relentlessly. Cracks appeared in the supposedly impregnable structure. The weak bonding layers between daily concrete pours, the hidden construction flaw from the 1880s, began to separate. Large sections of concrete fractured and shifted. Inside the fort, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The ventilation system failed, blocked by debris from shell impacts. Concrete dust made breathing difficult. The counterscarp galleries, outlying structures housing kitchens, latrines, and storage rooms, became untenable as shells struck nearby, filling them with toxic fumes. The garrison crowded into the central massif, packed shoulder to shoulder in chambers never designed to hold the entire complement simultaneously. Communication systems broke down. Telephone lines connecting the fort to neighboring positions were severed by shellfire. Signal flags could not be displayed because observation posts were destroyed. The garrison existed in isolation, cut off from information about the broader battle, uncertain whether relief might come or whether they stood alone against an unstoppable force. The psychological impact of siege artillery bombardment proved as devastating as the physical damage. The fort's defenders had volunteered for garrison duty, believing modern fortifications made them nearly invulnerable. They had trained on weapons that could strike enemy formations kilometers away. They had confidently manned their positions when the war began, certain their concrete shelters would protect them against anything Germany could throw at them. Now that confidence evaporated with each thunderous impact. The concrete that was supposed to protect them cracked and crumbled. The ventilation that was supposed to sustain them emitted poison gases. The ammunition magazines, positioned just meters below their feet, represented catastrophic danger if a shell penetrated to that depth. Every impact might be the one that triggered a magazine explosion, obliterating the entire garrison in an instant. Fort de Vegne surrendered on August 11th after 3 days of bombardment. The garrison emerged in conditions similar to Barchon's defenders, exhausted, deafened, half-blinded by dust, their nerves shattered by the incessant thunder of impacts. German soldiers watching the surrender were simultaneously elated at their success and disturbed by what modern warfare did to human beings. A German officer who witnessed the Belgian garrisons emerging from their fortresses recorded his impressions with brutal honesty. They came out staggering, choking, falling down and getting up again. Their nerves were gone. The fumes, the gases, the shock, the fire, all these had distracted them. They danced, sang, wept, laughed, shouted in a sort of maudlin frenzy. Some were silent and rigid, their eyes glassy. They were deafened, and some of them could not see, but had to grope their way. I do not care to see anything like that again, even if it is my enemies that suffer it. Despite these successes, German progress remained frustratingly slow. The 210mm mortars could damage forts and create intolerable conditions for their garrisons, but achieving decisive results took days per fortress. The Liège ring contained 12 forts total. At the current pace, reducing all of them would require weeks, time Germany's strategic timetable could not afford. Fort de Chaudefontaine, the small square fort southeast of the city, came under bombardment and surrendered on August 13th at 9 a.m., as its garrison faced the same threat of suffocation from accumulated gases. 3 forts down, 9 still fighting. The German armies scheduled to sweep through Belgium remained halted at the frontier, their massive columns jamming the roads, their supply systems straining, their commanders growing increasingly frustrated. The German High Command recognized that conventional siege artillery, while effective, was too slow. The situation demanded weapons of far greater power, weapons that could crack open a major fort not in days, but in hours. Such weapons existed, but only 2 prototypes had been completed before the war began, and they represented the most closely guarded secret in the German arsenal. In early August 1914, orders went out from the highest levels of command. Transport the 2 prototype super heavy howitzers to Belgium immediately. The weapons had been tested only months earlier. Their performance in combat remained unknown. But the situation at Liège left no alternative. Germany needed a weapon that could shatter 4 meters of concrete with a single shell, reduce a fortress to rubble in hours, and break Belgian resistance before the entire invasion schedule collapsed. The secret weapons were already on their way. Massive, terrible, and unlike anything the world had seen. The Belgians called them devil guns. History would know them by another name, borrowed from the German affection for the Krupp industrial heiress whose company manufactured them. Big Bertha. Big Bertha. In the industrial heartland of Germany, at the Krupp works in Essen, 2 massive artillery pieces occupied special assembly halls under the tightest security the German military could enforce. Guards checked credentials at multiple checkpoints. Engineers signed confidentiality agreements under threat of court-martial. Even within the sprawling Krupp complex, only those with direct involvement knew the weapons existed. The 42-centimeter Kurze Marine Kanone 14 L12, officially designated the M-Gerät in military documents, represented the most powerful mobile artillery piece ever built. The nickname Big Bertha came not from its specifications, but from affection. German workers and soldiers, noting that Bertha Krupp von Bohlen und Halbach was the heiress to the industrial empire, began calling the massive weapon after her. Big Bertha entered history. The specifications were staggering. The barrel measured 420 millimeters in diameter, 16.5 inches, capable of firing shells weighing up to 810 kilograms for high explosive rounds and 1,160 kilograms for armor-piercing projectiles. Maximum range reached 9,300 meters under optimal conditions. The weapon weighed 42.6 metric tons in firing position. Each complete Big Bertha unit required a crew of 240 men to operate. The shells themselves were engineering marvels. High explosive projectiles contained 106 kilograms of picric acid or trinitrotoluene, bursting charges that generated approximately 15,000 lethal fragments with killing radius extending nearly 2 kilometers from impact point. But the most critical innovation was the delayed action fuse, designed to allow the shell to penetrate up to 12 meters of concrete and earth before detonating. This meant Big Bertha shells would not waste their explosive force breaking through the roof. They would penetrate deep into the fort's interior, then detonate inside, where the explosion would be confined and intensified by the surrounding structure. The blast would tear through internal walls, collapse corridors, trigger secondary explosions in ammunition storage, and create overpressure conditions that would rupture human internal organs even without direct fragmentation injury. Transportation presented enormous challenges. The weapons had been designed for siege warfare, but actual mobility required innovative engineering. Each Big Bertha disassembled into 5 separate loads: the barrel and breech mechanism, the recoil system, the mounting platform, the traversing gear, and the transport carriage. Each component weighed between 16 and 20 metric tons, far too heavy for horse teams. Krupp engineers designed specially modified gas-powered tractors capable of towing these enormous loads, but only at walking pace, approximately 7 kilometers per hour on good roads, slower on rough terrain. The weapons traveled by railway to the Belgian frontier, then offloaded at the village of Mortier near Liège for the final approach by tractor. Assembly required between 5 and 6 hours under optimal conditions, with experienced crews working from detailed technical manuals. The barrel sections had to be lifted by mechanical hoists and precisely aligned. The recoil systems contained intricate hydraulic mechanisms that required careful adjustment. The traversing gear allowed the weapon to shift aim horizontally, but the process was slow and deliberate. Big Bertha was not designed for rapid fire against moving targets, but for methodical destruction of stationary fortifications. The rate of fire topped out at approximately 8 shells per hour once the weapon was positioned and calibrated. Each shell required careful handling during loading. The 810-kilogram projectiles could not simply be manhandled into the breech. Mechanical hoists lifted the shells from their protective casings, positioned them at the breech, then hydraulic rams drove them home. The propellant charges followed, then the breech locked. Fire control required sophisticated calculation. The shells followed high parabolic trajectories, arcing up to altitudes of several thousand meters before descending nearly vertically onto their targets. Gunners had to account for air density, wind conditions, barrel wear affecting muzzle velocity, and precise range measurements to impact points. Forward observers with telescopes and range-finding equipment directed fire, calling corrections after each shot. The German High Command had rushed Big Bertha's development when pre-war planning indicated Belgium's fortress rings might present obstacles to the invasion. The weapons had been scheduled for completion in October 1914, but the outbreak of war in August accelerated the timetable. Only 2 were ready for deployment when Liège's forts proved resistant to conventional artillery. On August 9, as conventional siege guns continued their slow work against the Belgian fortresses, the 2 Big Bertha units began their journey from the Mortier rail depot to firing positions around Liège. The tractors labored along country roads, churning through mud, forcing engineers to lay wooden planking across soft ground to prevent the massive loads from bogging down. Belgian civilians watched in amazement and terror as the enormous gun components passed through their villages. German security troops cleared civilians from areas around the intended firing positions. Engineers surveyed the ground, marking precise locations where the weapons would be assembled. Working parties dug ammunition storage bunkers and protective earthworks for the gun crews. Communication teams laid telephone cables connecting the firing positions to forward observation posts and command headquarters. By August 11, the first Big Bertha was assembled and ready for action. Ammunition arrived, the specialized 810-kilogram shells transported individually in padded caskets to prevent accidental detonation. Gun crews conducted final checks on the recoil systems and traversing mechanisms. Forward observers established positions with clear views of Fort de Pontis, the large fortress dominating Liège's northern approaches, selected as Big Bertha's first target. General Lehmann, directing the defense from Fort de Loncin, knew German reinforcements were arriving, but could not know their nature. Belgian intelligence reports mentioned unusually large guns being transported by rail, but the size and capability remained uncertain. Fort commanders checking their defenses noted the concrete roofs with satisfaction, 4 meters of solid material that had resisted conventional artillery for days. On the afternoon of August 12, at precisely 5:40 p.m., the order was given. Big Bertha fired its first combat shell in history. The massive weapon bucked against its hydraulic recoil system, the barrel rising and falling in controlled motion. The shell arced upward into the clear August sky, reaching the apex of its trajectory, then accelerated downward under gravity's pull toward Fort de Pontis, 3 kilometers distant. The impact announced a new era in warfare. The 810-kilogram shell struck the fort's concrete roof, the delayed action fuse allowing penetration through the supposedly impregnable barrier, then detonated deep inside the structure. The explosion was cataclysmic. Concrete fractured, support beams shattered, shock waves transmitted through the entire fortress. The garrison, believing themselves protected by 4 meters of concrete, experienced the arrival of a weapon that rendered their defenses meaningless. Fort de Pontis would endure 2 days of Big Bertha bombardment before surrendering. But from that moment, on August 12, 1914, everyone involved knew the fundamental calculus of modern warfare had changed. Fortifications that took years to build and had stood for decades could be destroyed in hours by weapons that doubled the caliber they were designed to resist. The fortress age was ending, killed by industrial engineering and high explosives. Inside Fort de Pontis on the afternoon of August 12, 1914, the garrison performed routine tasks despite the background rumble of artillery fire. Conventional German siege guns had been hammering various forts for days, and while the bombardments were unpleasant, the 4-meter concrete roof had held firm. Shells burst against the exterior, transmitting shock through the structure, but causing no catastrophic damage. The garrison had grown almost accustomed to the noise and vibration. At 5:40 p.m., that changed forever. The first Big Bertha shell descended from the sky at tremendous velocity, its delayed action fuse allowing it to punch completely through the concrete roof before detonating deep inside the fort. The explosion that followed was unlike anything the garrison had experienced. The blast wave raced through corridors at supersonic speed, rupturing eardrums and collapsing lungs. Concrete dust erupted in choking clouds. Massive sections of the roof structure fractured and shifted. Support beams, designed to carry thousands of tons of overhead weight, twisted and buckled. Men standing in the central massif were thrown off their feet by the concussion. Those in chambers near the impact point died instantly.
crushed by collapsing concrete or shredded by thousands of shell fragments that ricocheted through confined spaces at lethal velocities. The survivors, deafened and disoriented, stumbled through darkness as electric lights failed and emergency lanterns provided only dim illumination through the swirling dust. The Belgian garrison commander attempted to assess the damage, but communication systems had been destroyed by the blast. Telephone lines to other forts were severed. Internal speaking tubes were blocked with debris. He sent runners through the corridors to contact different sections of the garrison, piece together casualty reports, and determine if the fort remained defensible. 20 minutes later, the second Big Bertha shell arrived. This impact struck a different section of the roof, penetrating through and detonating in a corridor connecting the central massif to one of the counterscarp galleries. The explosion severed the passageway completely, trapping men on the far side without access to the main garrison. More concrete fractured, additional casualties mounted. The ventilation system, damaged by the first impact, now failed entirely. Air inside the fort grew thick and stale. The shells continued arriving at roughly 8-minute intervals, the maximum rate of fire Big Bertha's crew could sustain. Each impact was a separate catastrophe. The third shell penetrated near a stairwell, collapsing it and burying a squad of infantry soldiers under tons of debris. The fourth shell struck close to one of the 210mm gun turrets, jamming its rotating mechanism and rendering the weapon inoperative. The fifth shell detonated near a secondary ammunition magazine, triggering a sympathetic explosion that killed everyone in that section of the fort. By nightfall on August 12, Fort de Pontis had absorbed approximately 20 Big Bertha shells. The supposedly impregnable fortress was being systematically dismantled. Large sections of the roof had collapsed entirely. Interior corridors were choked with rubble. Casualties mounted into the dozens, then scores. The survivors crowded into the deepest chambers, as far from the surface as possible, waiting for the next impact and wondering whether it would be the one that triggered the main magazine. The bombardment continued through the night. German crews working by artificial light kept up the steady rhythm. Hoist the 810-kilogram shell, load it into the breech, ram home the propellant charges, lock the breech mechanism, fire, wait for the recoil cycle to complete, then begin again. Forward observers with night vision equipment called corrections, walking the impacts across different sections of the fort to ensure comprehensive destruction.
Inside Fort de Pontis, time became meaningless. Men existed in a nightmare of recurring explosions, each one potentially the last thing they would ever hear. The wounded could not be properly treated because the fort's infirmary had been destroyed. Water lines were severed, leaving the garrison dependent on emergency supplies that would not last long. Food was irrelevant. No one had appetite amid the dust and chemical stench. The psychological damage was as profound as the physical destruction. These men had volunteered for fortress duty, believing modern fortifications made them nearly invulnerable to artillery. They had manned their guns confidently when the war began. They had repulsed German infantry attacks and weathered conventional artillery bombardment with professional competence. Now they cowered in the deepest chambers of a disintegrating fortress, helpless before a weapon that could reach them anywhere. The concrete that was supposed to protect them had become their prison. The deep underground chambers meant as shelters now felt like tombs. Every man understood that if the main magazine detonated, and it was only a matter of time before a shell penetrated that deep, none of them would survive. Dawn on August 13th brought no relief. If anything, the bombardment intensified as German crews, now experienced with the weapon and confident in their procedures, increased their rate of fire.
Shell after shell descended on Fort de Pontis. Entire sections of the fortress simply ceased to exist, reduced to rubble. The garrison commander, recognizing that continued resistance meant the annihilation of his entire command, made the impossible decision. At 12:30 p.m. on August 13th, Fort de Pontis raised the white flag. German infantry cautiously approached the fort, unsure what they would find. When the Belgian garrison emerged through the shattered gates, the German soldiers were shocked by what they saw. These were not defeated soldiers in any conventional sense. These were men broken by an experience beyond the normal parameters of warfare. The Belgian defenders staggered out of the fort, coughing and choking, their faces blackened by smoke and concrete dust, their eyes vacant and staring. Some laughed hysterically, others wept openly. A few sang fragments of half-remembered songs. Several walked in tight circles, seemingly unaware of their surroundings. Many had to be led by the hand like children, their psychological trauma rendering them incapable of basic functions. A German officer recorded his horror at what he witnessed. They came out staggering, choking, falling down and getting up again. Their nerves were gone. The fumes, the gases, the shock, the fire, all these had distracted them. They danced, sang, wept, laughed, shouted in a sort of maudlin frenzy. Some were silent and rigid, their eyes glassy. They were deafened, and some of them could not see, but had to grope their way. I do not care to see anything like that again, even if it is my enemies that suffer it. The German soldiers helped the Belgian survivors away from the fort, providing water and basic medical attention. The Belgians did not resist. They could barely comprehend where they were or what was happening. The psychological impact of modern siege artillery bombardment had been as devastating as the physical destruction. Behind them, Fort de Pontis lay in ruins. The massive concrete structure that had taken years to build and was supposed to withstand month-long sieges had been reduced to rubble in approximately 24 hours. Large sections of the roof had collapsed into the interior chambers. Gun turrets sat askew, their mechanisms destroyed. Ammunition magazines were exposed to the sky. The fortress was no longer defensible. It was no longer even recognizable as a fortification. Word of Fort de Pontis's fate spread rapidly through the remaining Belgian garrisons. The other fort commanders, monitoring the bombardment and seeing the results, understood what they now faced. The fortress ring was not impregnable. The concrete was not adequate protection. Big Bertha could reach them anywhere, penetrate their defenses, and reduce their positions to rubble. Continued resistance meant certain destruction. But Belgian orders remained unchanged. Hold the forts, delay the German advance, give the French and British armies time to deploy. General Lehmann, commanding from Fort de Lanson, had no illusions about the ultimate outcome. The forts would fall. But every hour of delay served the Allied cause. Honor demanded they fight until resistance became physically impossible. The German artillery crews, having proven Big Bertha's effectiveness against Fort de Pontis, now prepared to unleash the weapon against the remaining fortresses. The systematic destruction of Liège's fortress ring accelerated. The shells that had taken years to develop and months to manufacture would now rain down on concrete structures that had stood for 23 years, reducing them to rubble in hours. With Fort de Pontis destroyed, the German artillery commanders had proven Big Bertha's effectiveness beyond any doubt. The systematic destruction of Liège's remaining forts accelerated as German crews refined their procedures and prepared to unleash the superweapons against multiple targets simultaneously.
The two Big Bertha units could not engage all remaining forts at once, so German planners prioritized targets based on strategic importance and fields of fire. Fort de Chaudfontaine, the small square fort southeast of the city that had already endured conventional bombardment, surrendered on August 13th at 9 a.m. before Big Bertha could target it. The garrison commander, having heard reports of Fort de Pointis's destruction and facing ventilation system failure that threatened suffocation, chose to save his men rather than endure annihilation. Fort d'Ambour, another small fortress to the south, came under sustained conventional artillery fire throughout August 13th. By 5:30 p.m., with its defenses compromised and communications severed, the garrison surrendered. 5 forts down, 7 still fighting. But those 7 remaining fortresses now understood their fate. The question was not whether they would fall, but how long they could hold and at what cost. Every hour of continued resistance delayed the German armies massed at the frontier. Every shell Germany expended against the forts was a shell not available for use against French armies to the west or Russian forces to the east. On the morning of August 14th, German engineers began emplacing Big Bertha for attacks on Fort de Liège to the north and Fort de Fleurons to the east. Forward observers established new positions. Ammunition was stockpiled near the firing positions. Communication lines were tested. The crews went through their pre-firing checklists with professional efficiency. Men who had trained for years to operate weapons that had existed only as prototypes weeks earlier. Fort de Liège, watching German preparations through periscopes and noting the telltale signs of big gun emplacement, faced an agonizing decision. The garrison could wait for Big Bertha's bombardment and endure the same horror that had broken Fort de Pointis, or they could surrender immediately and save their men. Honor demanded resistance. Practicality counseled survival. The garrison commander chose his men over glory. On the morning of August 14th, before Big Bertha could open fire, Fort de Liège raised the white flag. The garrison emerged intact, having fired not a single shot at Germany's superweapon. Critics would later question whether this constituted cowardice or wisdom. The garrison commander's defenders noted that pointless death served no purpose. Delay could be achieved by merely existing as a threat, forcing Germans to deploy resources for siege operations whether shots were fired or not. Fort de Fleurons, the large fortress east of the city that had repulsed multiple German infantry attacks and withstood days of conventional artillery bombardment, now faced Big Bertha directly. The first shells arrived in the afternoon of August 14th. The effects mirrored Fort de Pointis: penetration through the concrete roof, deep detonation inside the structure, catastrophic damage to interior chambers, mounting casualties, psychological trauma. The 210mm gun turrets that had dominated the approaches for over a week now became liabilities. Big Bertha shells targeted the turret mechanism specifically, jamming the rotation systems and rendering the weapons inoperative. With its primary armament destroyed, Fort de Fleurons lost its ability to provide defensive fire. The garrison could only hunker down and endure the bombardment, waiting for the inevitable magazine detonation that would end everything.
Fort de Fleurons surrendered on the afternoon of August 14 after approximately 6 hours of Big Bertha bombardment. The garrison emerged in the same psychologically shattered condition as Fort de Pointis's defenders, men who had descended into hell and somehow survived. Fort de Boncelles to the south and Fort de Lanson to the west faced similar fates on August 15. Both endured Big Bertha bombardment. Both surrendered after hours of punishment. The fort commanders could no longer justify the casualties. The strategic calculation had changed. Holding for days might serve Allied interests, but holding for hours after the position became indefensible merely killed men to no purpose. By the evening of August 15, 9 of Liège's 12 forts had fallen. Only 3 remained: Fort de Holon to the west, Fort de Flamal to the southwest, and Fort de Lanson to the northwest. The fortress where General Lehmann had established his command post and where he directed Belgium's desperate defense. Fort de Lanson was the strongest position in the entire ring. Its twin 210mm howitzer turrets commanded vast killing zones to the northwest. Its garrison numbered approximately 550 men, larger than most other forts. Its concrete construction was slightly more robust than earlier fortresses, incorporating lessons learned from the initial building phase. If any fort could resist Big Bertha, Lanson stood the best chance. But resistance was not the same as immunity. Big Bertha's 810-kilogram shells could penetrate 12 meters of concrete. Lanson's roof was only 4 meters thick. The delayed action fuses would allow the shells to punch through the barrier and detonate deep inside, where they would do maximum damage. The fort's strength merely meant it would take longer to destroy, hours instead of minutes, but the outcome was predetermined. On the morning of August 15, German artillery observers established positions with clear views of Fort de Lanson. The Big Bertha crews completed their preparations. Ammunition was stockpiled. Communication lines were tested. Forward observers called range estimates. The gun crews loaded the first 810-kilogram shell and waited for the order to fire. At 5 a.m., the bombardment of Fort de Lanson began. Inside the fortress, General Lehmann understood this was likely his last day of freedom. The fort would fall. The question was whether he would survive the bombardment or die with his command. He moved through the corridors speaking with soldiers, reinforcing their resolve, thanking them for their service. Many of these men would not see another dawn. The Big Bertha shells arrived at 8-minute intervals with mechanical precision. Each impact transmitted shock waves through the entire structure. Concrete dust filled the air. The electric lights failed, plunging sections of the fort into darkness, broken only by emergency lanterns. Casualties mounted as internal explosions sent fragments ricocheting through confined spaces. By late morning, Fort de Lanson had absorbed more than 30 Big Bertha shells. The roof showed multiple penetrations. Interior corridors were blocked with rubble. The ventilation system had failed. The garrison crowded into the deepest chambers, as far from the surface as possible, waiting for the next impact. The ammunition magazines, containing approximately 12,000 kilograms of gunpowder, sat in chambers positioned dangerously close to the surface. The fort's designers in the 1880s had not anticipated weapons capable of penetrating 4 meters of concrete. They had positioned the magazines for convenient access to the guns rather than maximum protection from above. This design flaw was about to exact its final terrible price.
August 15, 1914, continued with relentless bombardment of Fort de Lanson. The Big Bertha crews had fallen into efficient rhythm. Load the massive shell, ram home the propellant charges, lock the breech, fire, observe the impact through forward telescopes, calculate corrections, wait for the recoil cycle to complete, then begin again. 8 shells per hour. 8 opportunities for catastrophe. 8 moments when a single impact in the wrong location would end everything. Inside Fort de Lanson, General Lehmann maintained command despite the chaos. Runners brought reports from different sections of the garrison. Casualties mounting, ammunition expenditure, structural damage assessments. The telephone lines connecting to other forts had been severed hours ago. Communication with higher command was impossible. Lehmann and his garrison fought in isolation, cut off from information about the broader battle. The morning bombardment had destroyed the fort's primary armament.
The twin 210mm howitzer turrets, designed to dominate the northwestern approaches, sat silent and motionless. Big Bertha shells had penetrated near the turret mechanisms, jamming the hydraulic systems that rotated the massive gun mounts. The weapons that had fired thousands of shells defending Liège were now useless metal masses. The smaller gun positions fared no better. The 150mm turrets were inoperative. The 120mm guns in armored casemates had been silenced. Only a few 57mm rapid-fire weapons remained functional, and those were useless against artillery bombardment from beyond visual range. Fort d'Alençon could no longer defend itself. It could only absorb punishment and hope to survive until circumstances changed. By noon, the garrison had endured 7 hours of systematic destruction. More than 40 Big Bertha shells had penetrated the concrete roof, each one detonating deep inside the structure and causing cumulative damage. Large sections of the interior were impassable, blocked by collapsed ceiling sections and rubble. The wounded accumulated in the medical station faster than the fort's single doctor could treat them. The psychological toll was devastating. Men who had withstood German infantry assaults with courage, who had fired their weapons with professional competence, who had maintained discipline through conventional artillery bombardment, now reached their breaking points. Some wept openly. Others stared at walls with vacant eyes. A few prayed continuously. All understood they were helpless before a weapon they could neither see nor fight. At 5 p.m., as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, a German artillery observer noted the exact time in his log: 1700 hours. The 24th shell of the afternoon bombardment descended toward Fort d'Alençon. The forward observers watched through telescopes, ready to call the impact point and calculate corrections for the next shot. The shell struck the concrete roof, its delayed action fuse allowing penetration through the 4-meter barrier. The projectile punched downward through the fractured concrete, through the rubble of previous impacts, descending toward the deepest levels of the fortress. And then it entered an ammunition magazine containing 12,000 kilograms of gunpowder. The detonation was cataclysmic. 12 tons of gunpowder exploded simultaneously in a confined space, releasing energy equivalent to a small tactical nuclear weapon. The blast wave raced through Fort d'Alençon's corridors at supersonic speed, instantly killing everyone within 100 meters of the magazine. The concrete roof did not merely fracture, it disintegrated. Massive sections of the central massif blown upward and outward in all directions.
The explosion was visible from kilometers away. A mushroom cloud of dust, smoke, and pulverized concrete rose hundreds of meters into the sky. The ground shook as if from an earthquake. Windows shattered in Liège. Soldiers in neighboring forts felt the shockwave transmitted through the earth. German artillery crews paused their work and stared at the towering dust cloud, awed by what they had achieved and horrified by what modern warfare had become. Inside Fort d'Alençon, what remained of it, 350 of the 550-man garrison died in that instant. Most were killed by the initial blast wave, their bodies pulverized by the overpressure or buried under collapsing concrete. Some were incinerated by the flash of burning gunpowder. Others were crushed as tens of thousands of tons of concrete fell into the ruptured chambers. Only approximately 17 men emerged from the fort alive and conscious. General Lemon was in a corridor distant from the magazine when the explosion occurred. The blast wave threw him against a wall. The ceiling collapsed, burying him under rubble.
He lost consciousness, buried alive in the wreckage of his command post. His aide-de-camp, Commandant Collard, died instantly in a different section of the fort. German infantry, watching from forward positions, saw the massive explosion and initially assumed the entire garrison had been killed. They cautiously approached the smoking ruins, uncertain whether any survivors existed. The fort had been transformed from a military installation into a tomb. The central massif no longer existed. In its place was a crater filled with twisted steel reinforcement bars and shattered concrete. German soldiers began searching through the wreckage for survivors. They found scattered groups of Belgian defenders, most unconscious or delirious, buried under debris. Working parties with shovels began excavating, pulling Belgian soldiers from the rubble. Some had been protected by interior walls that partially shielded them from the blast. Others had been in the deepest chambers where some structural integrity remained. In the fort's ditch, the defensive trench surrounding the perimeter, German soldiers found General Lehmann. He lay unconscious under concrete slabs, his uniform torn and blackened, blood covering his face from head wounds. A Belgian aide, believing his commander dead, said to the Germans, "Respectez le général, il est mort." Respect the general, he is dead. At the sound of voices, Lehmann regained consciousness. He opened his eyes and found himself surrounded by German soldiers. The realization of what had happened, his fort destroyed, his garrison annihilated, himself captured, was immediately apparent. For a man of Lehmann's honor and sense of duty, capture was worse than death. The German soldiers carefully extracted Lehmann from the rubble and provided immediate medical attention. He had suffered concussion, multiple lacerations, and possible internal injuries from the blast. But he was conscious and coherent. As they led him away from the smoking ruins, Lehmann reportedly said, "Put in your dispatches that I was unconscious." He wanted history to record that he had not surrendered, that only unconsciousness had enabled his capture. Fort d'Alençon, the strongest fortress in the ring and the last real obstacle to German advance, had been obliterated. The garrison that had fought with such determination for 11 days lay buried in the rubble. General Lehmann, Belgium's most determined commander, was now a prisoner of war. The fortress ring that was supposed to protect Liège for months had fallen in less than 2 weeks. Only 2 forts remained operational, Hollen and Flamal, both in sectors of secondary importance. Their commanders, having witnessed Fort d'Alençon's destruction, understood continued resistance was futile. They would surrender on August 16th, ending the Battle of Liège. In a field hospital behind German lines, General Lehmann regained full consciousness on the morning of August 16th. His head was bandaged. His ribs were wrapped where the blast had injured him. German medical staff treated him with professional courtesy, aware they were caring for a man who had become something of a legend even among his enemies. General Otto von Emich, commander of the German forces that had captured Liège, came to visit his captured counterpart. The meeting between the two generals represented one of the war's more remarkable moments, a brief return to older codes of military honor before the conflict descended into total war and mutual hatred. Emich approached Lehmann with formal respect. In his hands, he carried Lehmann's sword, the symbol of a Belgian general's rank and authority. Military tradition held that captured commanders surrendered their swords to their captors as acknowledgement of defeat. But Emich, recognizing the extraordinary courage Lehmann and his garrison had displayed, made a different choice. He returned the sword to Lehmann with words that would be recorded by multiple witnesses and enter military history. "No, General, keep your sword. To have crossed swords with you has been an honor." A German officer present noted that the fire in General Lehmann's eye was dimmed by a tear. The gesture was remarkable for several reasons. Emich himself had been awarded Germany's highest military decoration, the Pour le Mérite, for capturing Liège. His career had been made by this victory. Yet he acknowledged that Belgian resistance, though ultimately futile, had been professionally executed and honorably maintained. Lehmann had not surrendered. He had fought until physically incapacitated by the fort's destruction. From captivity, en route to prisoner of war camps in Germany, Lehmann composed a letter to King Albert I of Belgium. The message revealed the general state of mind, the conflict between military duty, personal honor, and the reality of modern warfare. I am convinced that the honor of our arms has been sustained. I have not surrendered either the fortress or the forts. I am physically shattered by the explosion of Lonsin. In Germany, whither I am proceeding, my thoughts will be, as they have ever been, of Belgium and the King. I would willingly have given my life the better to serve them, but death was denied me. The phrase, "death was denied me," captured the tragedy of a professional soldier who believed dying with his command was preferable to capture. Lehmann felt he had failed by surviving. History would judge differently. His defense of Liège had delayed Germany's invasion and transformed Belgium's violation from a strategic calculation into a moral outrage that helped bring Britain into the war. On August 16th, the final two forts surrendered. Fort de Hollong raised the white flag in the morning. Fort de Flémal, the last fortress still flying the Belgian colors, surrendered that same morning. The Battle of Liège, which had begun on August 5, ended on August 16th. 12 days of combat that German planners had allocated just 48 hours to complete. The casualty figures reflected the brutality of modern warfare. Belgian casualties totaled approximately 20,000 men, including roughly 3,000 killed or wounded in the fighting and 4,000 captured. Civilian deaths in the Liège area during the battle exceeded 850, many of them murdered in German reprisals against suspected Franc-Tireur resistance. German casualties were substantial despite their ultimate victory. Approximately 5,300 Germans were killed or wounded by August 8th, most during the initial infantry assaults before heavy artillery arrived. The 34th Brigade alone lost 1,180 men in a single night attack. Total German casualties for the entire battle likely exceeded 6,000. The strategic impact of Liège's resistance became a subject of immediate debate. German commanders claimed the delay was minimal, perhaps 48 hours at most. General von Kluck estimated 4 to 5 days. Belgian and Allied sources claimed up to 2 weeks. Modern historians generally conclude the true delay was somewhere between 3 and 5 days, significant but not decisive. However, the moral and political impact far exceeded the military delay. Britain's entry into the war had been uncertain until Germany violated Belgian neutrality. The dramatic resistance at Liège, widely publicized in Allied newspapers, transformed brave little Belgium into a powerful propaganda symbol. The Times of London declared Belgium had earned immortal renown by helping shatter the superstition that the German armies were invincible. The technical lessons were immediate and profound. Every nation with fortress systems re-evaluated their defenses. France removed artillery from fortress complexes to reinforce field armies, a decision they would later regret at Verdun. Russia similarly stripped fortifications, believing mobile warfare had made static defenses obsolete. Only later would military planners realize the lesson was more nuanced. Unreinforced 1880s concrete was vulnerable to super-heavy artillery, but modern reinforced concrete could resist even Big Bertha if properly constructed. The Germans applied their lessons immediately. At Namur, Belgium's second fortress ring, they waited for heavy artillery to arrive before launching infantry assaults. The bombardment began August 21. Namur fell on August 25, just 4 days compared to Liège's 12. The forts at Maubeuge in France fell even faster. Big Bertha had proven its value, and German commanders now understood how to employ the weapon effectively. Big Bertha itself became legendary, though the weapon's actual capabilities were often exaggerated in wartime propaganda. Allied newspapers claimed shells weighing over 2,000 kilograms, ranges exceeding 20 kilometers, and destructive power bordering on apocalyptic. The reality, 810-kilogram shells with 9,300-meter range, was impressive enough without embellishment. Fort de Lonson remained a smoking ruin, never rebuilt. The bodies of the garrison stayed buried in the rubble where they fell. Belgian authorities declared the site a national necropolis, a war grave to be preserved in perpetuity. In 1920, King Albert I attended a memorial service at the fort, placing a wreath on the ruins and saluting the defenders who had sacrificed themselves for Belgium's honor. An inscription was placed at the fort's entrance. Passant, va dire à la Belgique et à la France qu'ici 550 Belges se sont sacrifiés pour la défense de la liberté et le salut du monde. Passer-by, go tell Belgium and France that here 550 Belgians sacrificed themselves for the defense of freedom and the salvation of the world. In 2007, nearly a century after the battle, Belgian authorities excavated portions of Fort de Lonson. They recovered 2,500 unexploded shells, weighing 142 tons total, a testament to the intensity of the bombardment. They also discovered 25 additional bodies, Belgian soldiers still in their positions after 93 years, casualties of the magazine explosion who had never been properly buried. General Lehmann survived the war as a prisoner in Germany, treated with respect by his captors, who recognized his courage. He returned to Belgium after the armistice, welcomed as a national hero. He died in 1920 at age 64, his health broken by the concussion he had suffered at Fort de Lonson.
The Battle of Liège had demonstrated that the industrial age had transformed warfare beyond what 19th-century military planners could imagine. Fortifications designed by Europe's greatest engineer, built from cutting-edge materials and considered impregnable for 25 years, had crumbled in hours under weapons that doubled the caliber they were designed to resist. The fortress age ended at Liège, killed by Big Bertha and the industrial capacity to manufacture weapons of unprecedented destructive power. Yet the battle also demonstrated that courage and determination could achieve strategic effects even in defeat. Liège's garrison could not win. The outcome was never in doubt once Big Bertha arrived. But their resistance delayed Germany's invasion during the critical opening weeks when every day mattered. The 12 days bought time for French armies to deploy, for British forces to cross the Channel, for Belgium's field army to retreat intact rather than being caught by advancing German columns. The fortress commanders who had laughed at conventional German artillery, confident in their concrete and steel, learned a terrible lesson about the pace of technological change. But they also demonstrated that honor, duty, and sacrifice retained meaning even in the face of weapons that made traditional courage seem obsolete. They fought not because they could win, but because their nation's honor demanded they fight. They held not because their fortifications were adequate, but because every hour of resistance served a larger strategic purpose. Fort de Lonson stands today as a memorial to that sacrifice, a ruined fortress where the bodies of defenders still lie buried, a reminder that behind every strategic calculation and technical specification were human beings who faced impossible choices and paid with their lives for their nation's decisions. The Battle of Liège announced the arrival of total war, industrial war, and weapons of mass destruction. But it also demonstrated that even in such a war, individual courage and collective sacrifice retained profound meaning.